I'm Ellis Cose. I'm an author and I'm a journalist, a lifelong journalist. I've been involved with several large institutions, including Newsweek magazine, including Time, used to run the editorial page of the New York Daily News. And I'm an author. I've written many books dealing with any number of subjects, from race in America to post-conflict societies and to democracy. And I'm here today to talk about my new book, which is The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America, which is a look at the conundrums that arise when one considers free speech, the history of free speech, and the danger that free speech is in today. I appreciate you tuning in and hope we have a very interesting conversation.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. Let me ask you, what do you need to do to up-level your leadership? As leaders, do we need to protect our people against microaggressions, trigger words, or language that might upset some folks? Or do we need to build higher levels of emotional resilience? Well, stay tuned, because today that's what you're going to discover. I'm your host, Dov Baron, and I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. To find out more, you can simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. This episode of Leadership and Loyalty is brought to you in part by the Dragon's Lair. Have you discovered your next evolution? Imagine being in a virtual classroom where I personally walk you through the live trainings where I reveal the techniques and strategies that are previously only offered to top CEOs, C-suite executives, high-level entrepreneurs, athletes, and entertainers, and then being able to access those trainings and exclusive workbooks on demand. Well, now that's what you can do, and many of our listeners are doing just that. To have that opportunity, you can simply go over to www.patreon.com/Dov Baron. That's patreon.com/Dov Baron. It'll just take you about 2 minutes to join us. And in fact, when you get there, you'll also have access to past episodes, including trainings on ethical persuasion, becoming a meaning-driven leader, resilient leadership in times of chaos, and many more. Just go to patreon.com/Dov Baron now and secure your seat. As always, you can find us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever you tune into podcasts. And if you are a regular listener, a big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners, with a potential reach of 2.5 to 4 million listeners for every single show over time. We are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. Let's be honest, as we record this, there is a lot to talk about right now. There's a global pandemic. 200,000 Americans are reportedly dead, and the numbers are not going down. The strongest of the liberal Supreme Court justices, the notorious RBG, recently passed away. President Trump has been impeached, and the latest polls show that internationally he's less trusted than both Putin and Xi Jinping. Add to that the explosive reactions to long-running police brutality, particularly against people of color, that's bubbled over into the streets. The Black Lives Matter movement has gone from protests to riots. The air is unbreathable, and the sky has become post-apocalyptic red as the West Coast is on fire. The East Coast is being battered by hurricanes. We're in an election year where the president stated that if he loses, he can't guarantee a peaceful transition of power. There is a lot to talk about. So here's the question. Are you, me, we truly free to speak about these things? Free speech, particularly in the US, is held as one of the many sacred cows, untouchable and unmovable. But is it true? Is there, in fact, a conflict between the idea of free speech and the actual history of it in America? Well, stay tuned, because that's exactly what you're going to discover in today's show because my guest on this episode is Ellis Cose. He is a Chicago native who holds a master's degree in science, technology, and public policy from George Washington University. Among his list of accolades, and they are outstanding, he is a contributor to the press critic. He's a press critic for Time Magazine, chief executive officer for the Institute of Journalism Education, chief writer on management and workplace issues for USA Today, a member of the editorial board of the Detroit Free Press, and there's much more. He's been recognized for writing groundbreaking books on subjects as diverse as Rage Among Black Middle Class, The Evolution of Post-Conflict Societies, and now the role of free speech in a democratic society. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me welcome esteemed journalist and writer of a book named as one of the Newsweek's 25 must-reads to escape the chaos of 2020, entitled The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America, Mr. Ellis Cose! Crowd goes wild, young man.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you, Dov. Good morning.
Thank you,
good
sir.
Afternoon.
It's good to have you, man. So one of the things we like to start with, I know we've got a lot to dig into, but we always like to start here because in these times of where everybody is an influencer, I'm always fascinated to know who is somebody who's impacted you? Who's somebody who we might not know of or may not recognize or may not expect, who's been a major influence on you and how you are as a leader in your own world?
Oh, I would say that's an easy one for me. The major first and most important influence on me was a woman named Gwendolyn Brooks. She was a Pulitzer Prize winning poet from Illinois. And I was a kid. I was a kid of 17. And I won't bore you with the whole story, but basically I was rebelling against English class. My English teacher and I had an argument, and we decided that rather than do the work that I found boring that she wanted me to do, she would give me my own assignment to do. So the assignment was to write a history of riots in America. And my community happened to be in a community that was torn up by riots when I was a kid. So I really got into the subject, produced a 140-page manuscript as a high school senior, took it to my teacher. She took it home. She came back the next Monday and said, Ellis, I'm going to give you an A, the top grade in this course, but I really can't evaluate this material. You need to send it to a professional. And I'm going, I don't know any professionals. Professional what? And she said,
plumber?
Yeah.
Professional chef? What?
And she said, well, there's this woman named Gwendolyn Brooks. Have you heard of her? I said, yes, I've heard of her. I think she's a poet laureate of Illinois, isn't she? She said, yes, she is. I said, okay, so what? I should go call her up. She said, well, she teaches at this university. Send it to her and see what she says. So I sent it to Gwendolyn Brooks. Don't hear anything for a couple of months, and I figure, okay, well, poet laureates, whatever they do, must be busy.
Well, must be busy writing poems.
Yeah, I figure. So then I hear from her finally. She calls me up. She invites me down to her office. And at the time, I thought I was actually going to be a mathematician or a physicist. That was sort of my passion at the time when I was in high school. And she looks at me and she says, first she takes my manuscript and she hands it to me, and she's written across it in red and blue ink. And she's written the words, one day you will be a great writer.
Wow.
And I'm going, huh? And then she begins to give me this lecture and basically says, look, kid, I don't know what it is you plan to do with your life, but you have a gift for writing. And I think that's what you ought to think about. And that sort of, for me, started my entire career arc. So the first influence was Gwendolyn Brooks. As I said, that's an easy one.
Yeah. And, you and I had talked about that. This was all happening while the riots were going on in Chicago about both of our heroes, MLK and his assassination. And you were really rebelling and actually not doing very well in English because you were frustrated with it. And you had said that. And that original manuscript that you just mentioned, you told me was on the history of riots in America.
Right.
Can you talk to us a little bit, because this is certainly a bone of contention right now, which is this distinction between protests and riots, and the side of people who are saying, well, I'm in favor of protests but not riots. And talk to us a little bit about, because you really understand this better than almost anybody that is out there.
Well, I mean, there's a long history of riots, not only in America, but across the world. And
Of
there's
course.
also a long history of protests. And they're fundamentally different. I mean, protests are political actions that are orchestrated to try to make a political point, to try to, in many cases, particularly when you talk about the United States and race, to bring up issues of inequity, inequality, and to try to get those addressed. I mean, there have been several during World War II. You know, there was a big protest plan to protest the lack of integration of the U.S. armed forces by Philip Randolph. It was ultimately called off because President Roosevelt agreed to integrate, to some extent at least, the armed forces. And there have been many other examples. You talk about Martin Luther King. I mean, his career began with the protests in Alabama against busing, or at least against the segregation in buses. And that was a very peaceful protest. But then there are riots, and most of the riots, which people don't tend to know when you talk about the United States, the long history of riots in the United States, the vast majority of them have been riots against Blacks. I mean, there was the riot in 1866, the draft riots in New York and elsewhere, which were a rebellion against Blacks who during the Civil War, whites thought or in the aftermath of the Civil War, whites thought were taking jobs from them. In the early 1900s, in 1919, there were huge riots. Basically, there were riots in Chicago, riots in Washington, D.C., riots in Arkansas, and they were all aimed at preventing Blacks from thinking that they had, and this was after the First World War, that was the war that was fought to make the world safe for democracy, in quotes. And these riots were all designed to prove to Blacks that they didn't have the rights. I mean, the riot in Lane, Arkansas was essentially over a group of poor Black sharecroppers organizing so they could get a fair price for their crops, their cotton crops. And this became, in the argot of the press of the time, it became a Black rebellion that needed to be put down, and hundreds of people were killed. The troops were brought in to put down this so-called rebellion, and it was simply a bunch of poor farmers organizing to form a union. So we now have this modern era where you have a combination of protests going on, and on some hand, riots on the other. Often these riots, or at least the violence, is precipitated by people who are connected to white militias or other groups who come in and want to oppose the protesters. And then in the minds of those who don't like the protests to begin with, the protesters get blamed for the riots. And so so our president, who obviously is not a fan of Black Lives Matter, is not a fan of peaceful protest, period, has taken this as an occasion to denounce the entire effort to reform police in the United States. And that's unfortunate, but we have a long history of that. We have a history in the South, for instance, which was segregated, rigidly segregated until the 1950s and 1960s. When people tried to change that, they were considered outside agitators, and the violence that erupted in the wake of that, generally, for the most part, propagated by whites who were angry that Blacks were protesting, was blamed on either the local Black people or so-called outside agitators who supposedly came in and riled up people who were very happy otherwise, who all of a sudden decided to start rioting. So we have a history of, by design, almost confusing protests with riots, because we tend to see protests against things that we don't think should be protested as wrong. Right.
So, but the thing that comes up for me around this, as I said, I was heavily influenced by Martin Luther King, and Martin Luther King was heavily influenced by Gandhi. And that when we look at these things, the peaceful, nonviolent protests of Gandhi, and you can see the Indians being beaten by the British.
Sure.
It's disgusting. And then you can see the same thing with MLK and the original civil rights movement. And, as a kid, I remember seeing those things and seeing these people who were peacefully protest, who refused to get involved in the violence of it. And there's an interesting piece here, Ellis, that I want to bring to you because of your history and understanding this, is when we look at the neutral people, so the people who say, I'm not going to get involved, when those people look at a protest and they see innocent people being beaten, they get off the fence and they go, this is not right. And they take a stand. But when they see a protest that then becomes becomes mutually violent on both sides, and I'm not saying it's not deserved, then those people say, these people are getting what they deserve. So the evidence that I see, at least, based on MLK, based on Gandhi, is that peaceful protest where we don't fight back is actually more effective in bringing about change. You have this history of riots and you've discovered all that. Am I off, or am I missing something, or is
No,
that...
I think that's absolutely true. I think the problem is that everyone's not a strategic thinker.
Right.
And so usually the leaders of these protests have no intention of their devolving into violence. And often, if we go back to the heyday of the riots in the 1960s, most of those did not start as peaceful protests to begin with. The vast majority of them erupted in the wake of police brutality.
Yes.
And people just got angry, and they often started throwing things at police, or they started throwing things at buildings, or they started breaking windows just because they were angry. The role of people like Martin Luther King back then, and other of the civil rights leaders, was to come in and try to calm things down. Invariably, they tried to say, look, let's try to do something productive. Because you're absolutely right. I mean, the protests in Selma, for instance, which led to the Voting Rights Act in 1965, that was a protest where John Lewis, who we just lost not too long ago, he was one of the leaders of that. And I had the privilege of getting to know him fairly well, but he was a person, who was viciously beaten many times within inches of his life as he was carrying out peaceful protests. But as the nation saw that these peaceful protesters were being ridden down by cops on horseback, were being beaten with billy clubs, people across America said, wait a minute, this can't be right.
Right.
And even Lyndon Johnson, joined in and said, wait a minute, we have to do something about this. And that ended up bringing about one of the most important acts that this country has seen. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court recently decided it wasn't that important, but it was responsible at the time for allowing African Americans, who for the most part were not permitted to vote in the South, despite the fact that they were legally allowed to. It allowed them access to the ballot.
Right. The interesting thing here for me is when I look at it politically, a lot of these movements, left, right, doesn't matter what it is, are co-opted. They're stolen away, and then they become manipulated and manipulated. When I look at what, I would say that I love what Black Lives Matter as a message is. Absolutely. But when I go look at the website and I read their stuff, there's a lot of Marxist shit that I'm like, you know what, you clearly don't understand what Marxism is. You're not old enough to, for those of us who are of a certain age, I remember Russia when it was the USSR, and, it wasn't so great. So that's part of my concern is that I think there's so many wonderful people doing wonderful work, and then it gets co-opted and perversed and changed into something else. As somebody who is you're a journalist, you're a writer, and you've definitely been part of that world in such a way. How do you respond to that? How do you see those kinds of things?
I agree with you, but I also see it as an unfortunate ancillary effect of people trying to protest against wrong things. You don't get to always choose your allies. And sometimes your allies have very different ideas about how to affect change than you do. I think what Martin Luther King was able to achieve, because he was the leader of that particular movement, was to say, these are the rules. And if you're going to be part of our movement, then you have to abide by these, and you can't strike back. You have to be nonviolent. There are different leaders who emerge, and I think a lot of the leadership that has emerged as part of some of the more modern movements, even going back to Malcolm X in the time of Martin Luther King, believe that violence sometimes is justified. But even with Black Lives Matter, I mean, the leadership, for one thing, is not centralized leadership. There are different leaders in different places. And so some people have one idea and some people have another idea. But even I would say the ones who are the most radical are not advocating violence. The violence, they are, as you say, have various ideas based in their version of socialism or such. But the violence has, for the most part, as far as I can see, been exported. It's been people who've come in from outside with violence. Now, you can disagree with the political perspective of the folks who, in some places, are in the leadership, and I think one has to respect that.
Yeah, I think that's part of the challenge when I look back. And again, I'm looking back, and looking back is always very easy. But when I look back, Martin Luther King was the leader, and it was clearly the leader. And then, of course, there was another leader, was Malcolm X, who really the most violent thing around Malcolm X was how he was assassinated. I mean,
right.
He wasn't really a violent guy. He said, it's justified sometimes, but there doesn't seem to be that leadership now. And as you said, it's sort of fragmented, and then we end up with all these mixed messages. But essentially, when we come down to it, we can put it into all kinds of things. We can talk about whether it's Black Lives Matter, or whether it's voters' rights, or whether it's gerrymandering, or whatever it is. But the bottom line of it is the ability to speak about it is about free speech. And in the United States, the First Amendment protects free speech. It was the first change in 1791, I think.
It was ratified in 1791.
Right, exactly. Right. So, and it's been part of a democracy's hallowed ground. And interestingly enough, I am based in Canada, although I speak a lot on American politics and have been involved in that since I was a kid. In Canada, June 2017, the Canadian government passed Bill C-16, which definitely impacted free speech and has caused a massive backlash here in Canada. Free speech may have been one of America's most revered freedoms, yet now more than ever, free speech is reshaping America's social and political landscape, and it's kind of coming under attack. You jump into that debate in your book, The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America, saying that you believe that this constitutional right has been co-opted by wealthy and politically corrupt people. Talk to us about this, because this is a profoundly important book, particularly today.
If you don't mind, let me just dip into the history for a second first, because I think it's important to understand that.
Yes,
because as you properly point out, the First Amendment was part of the Bill of Rights, which was ratified in 1791. And it contains the First Amendment, which gives freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and freedom to petition the government. Almost immediately, that amendment was violated with the Alien Sedition Acts in 1798, which basically made it made it illegal to speak out against the then Federalist Party government. So you had all kinds of people who were arrested for speaking out against the government. When Thomas Jefferson came in a few years later, that was overturned. So going back to the beginnings, we had a ambivalent relationship to the whole idea of free speech, even though it was in our Constitution. The other thing that's important to understand, is that the First Amendment prohibits the federal government, or to use the words of the amendment itself, Congress, from passing laws that prohibit free speech. Had no impact on the states. So for a long period of time, throughout most of our history, the states were within their rights to pass laws that barred your right to free speech. So, and a great example was the abolitionist movement. Most of the southern states passed laws that made it illegal to print literature that opposed slavery. And so you could be arrested, you could be flogged, and people were beaten for having literature on them, which was abolitionist literature. It was only in the 1920s that changed, that began to change, I should say. So that to say that in one hand, yes, the First Amendment is one of our most revered rights. It's been with us since 1791. But the modern idea of free speech only began to be with us in the 1920s, and that's, if you want me to go into it, I will. But that's a result of the excesses of World War I, and the growing consensus that something needed to be done by that, and also the rising up of organizations, principal among them the American Civil Liberties Union, which began to develop a whole free speech culture and a whole sort of way of combating the government's attempts to silence people. So even before we get to the modern era, and that's things like Citizens United and the efforts to change the way we speak, we had a huge period of struggle. We meaning the United States,
Sure.
Throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s to just define what we meant by free speech. I mentioned the fact that states were not prohibited by it. That did not change until 1925. There was a case that went to the Supreme Court called Gitlow v. New York. And at the time, many states had passed these laws that made it illegal to join the Communist Party or illegal to advocate things that looked like they might be talking about violent overthrow of the government. And so these young men had published some materials which seemed to fit that description. And they were convicted. These specific laws were called criminal syndicate laws, and they were convicted of violating these laws. And the conviction stood, and the Supreme Court looked at it and said, yeah, these guys seem like they were advocating violence, so let this conviction stand. But even as they did that, they also decided the principle that they tried to establish in this case of saying that this state law should not be able to do that. Right. They said, maybe you have a point here. They said the First Amendment ought to apply to states. And they, the legal term was that they basically brought the law in under the 14th Amendment. And it's a lot of legal talk we don't need to go into, but they essentially decided that because the 14th Amendment, the First Amendment applied to the states. And so for the first time, beginning in 1925, but it took a long time even after that for us to get
that's 150 years.
Yeah.
I mean, people need to get that. It's 150 years from this First Amendment being in the Constitution to anybody actually paying any real attention to it and not being able to find a way around it.
Oh yeah, I mean, the World War I was crazy in many ways when it came to the free speech. I mean, the biggest trial I think still in United States history was against a union called the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the world. And what they had done was essentially speak out against the war, right, which under the espionage laws and the Sedition Acts of 1917 and 1918 were prohibited. And so 166 members of that union were indicted all at one time, and they were all asked to come to a federal courtroom in Chicago. Something over 100 of them actually showed up, and they had the biggest mass trial in history. And the evidence that was presented was ridiculous. I mean, some of it consisted of dreams that a guy had about President Wilson being defeated, things of that nature. And they got
thought police. Another level.
And they got convicted. Oh
my God, convicted in your dreams? That is insane.
They all got convicted. They got 20 years for the maximum sentences. Some got 20 years, huge fines. Most of them were ultimately, I think all of them were ultimately freed years later in some cases. The leader of the union fled to Russia, but it pretty much destroyed the union. But another, and I know this is a bit of digression, but I just think it's funny, but another case in a weird sort of way, but another case that I think was really weird from back then there was a film producer who decided he was going to make a nice patriotic movie about based in the 1776 and the U.S. Revolution against the British, and he called it Spirit of 76. And the movie, among other things, documented or had scenes showing some atrocities that the British committed. he was called into court because at that point, the British were an ally of the United States in World War One, and you couldn't really criticize allies either.
Oh.
So he was convicted of violating the Sedition Act, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He only spent, I think, 3. It was commuted to time served after 3 years. But you had all of these, and I can go on and on. But you had all of these things that were being propagated in World War One. And then after World War One, you had the first Red Scare of the United States. It was in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. There was this whole fear of foreign communists coming in and taking over the country. So thousands of people were deported, and thousands were put in jail. Many of them were most of them were ultimately freed, but a lot of people served real time. Yeah. And so in the aftermath of that, the ACLU, which was born in 1920, which is right at the height of what we call the Palmer Raids. That was when they were sending federal agents across the country to arrest communists and Bolsheviks and suspicious foreigners, basically. Right after that period, the ACLU formed, and one of its big battles was to try to put an end to some of this stuff. And the government finally accepted the arguments that they shouldn't just be arresting people for their political beliefs, and so they did a lot less of that in World War II. But it actually took until 1969. There was another Supreme Court case called Brandenburg, when some of these cases were actually overturned. And the irony is that Brandenburg v. Ohio, and who was Brandenburg? He was a member of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. Yep. And he had a rally which was anti-Jewish and anti-Black, and they were talking about perpetrating violence on various minority groups, particularly Jews. And he got arrested. The leader got arrested for this, and only then did the Supreme Court decide that you really could not be arrested for your speech. So that's, I know it's a long prologue, but that by way of explaining how we got to where we finally got to in terms of our modern understanding of free speech, and it basically, and I've left out a lot obviously, but it basically protecting us against repercussions for most forms of speech. I think the problem now is that not so much that we have reprisals. I don't think we're going to repeat what happened in 1918 when 100 and so odd members of a union were hauled into court for publishing anti-war literature. I think that period is over. Right. I think the modern problem is that speech has been overtaken by people with much louder voices. If you go back to the original dissents of the 1920s, and one of the champions of free speech was Louis Brandeis, who was a Supreme Court justice at the time, and Oliver Wendell Holmes often joined him in his dissents. But his fundamental argument was that you needed free speech because free speech would ultimately allow you to get to the truth. Right. That it would, the vigorous back and forth of speech was a disinfectant against lies, and that in this battle, good speech would triumph over bad speech, and truth would triumph over lies. Well, if you sort of move forward to where we are now, that does not seem to be happening necessarily.
No. And I want to come to that because there's a whole big section in there that we do need to explore. But the point here that I want everybody to get before we even move another moment forward is that free speech, as we know it in a generalized sense, is not what we think it is.
Right.
That what it was originally took 150 years before it even became something resembling what it was maybe potentially was set out to become. And that free speech has, I know this because I've been following politics and political movements around the world for years, But free speech, is this thing that we sort of hold as a democratic idea that belongs to first world nations. But I have watched that free speech be beaten in the streets, as we talked about with protests and riots, for decades, looking back over my own life. As I look at that and I move forward with that, you're talking about this idea that, and particularly in your book, The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America, this constitutional right has been co-opted by the wealthy and the political, but it's also seems to be have been co-opted, and this is my opinion, by the left-wing politically correct movement, which is supposedly in favor of equal rights and in favor of justice for all and all that kind of stuff. But meanwhile, God forbid you should offend somebody, with your trigger words and your microaggressions, and it's interesting. I had a conversation with somebody yesterday, an interview yesterday, who is more right-wing for sure. And I'm very interested in everybody's point of view. And he said, if you take a look around, you'll find that people who are speaking out and sharing their political views are more left than they are right. And I was like, that's probably a pretty good point. The right might be louder, but there are more left, just general public people who are willing to share their views. And he says, yeah, because the backlash against that on the other side is so fierce, and anything you say could be taken wrong. And one of my arguments around that is, yeah, I grew up in a neighborhood, like I was born Jewish, and I grew up in a ghetto in Northern England, and my mates were Jamokes, and they were Packies, and they were all these names that were not politically correct, and I was called names that were not politically correct, and there was no negative intent, and none was taken. We had a level of emotional resilience around those kinds of things. And that worries me around free speech, or the lack thereof, is that, again, it's getting co-opted into what becomes, as we talked about earlier, sort of thought police.
That's a lot to unpack, and so let me.
Let me. A couple little bombs on you there, Ellis.
Let me try to begin, from my perspective, to do that. There's a lot of speech policing on the left, no question about that. And there's this, they call it cancel culture now, where people are reviled because they say something that's not considered appropriate by other people. I don't know. I'm sure you probably did watch parts of the Republican convention a few weeks ago, and you had at least 7 or 8 speakers proclaim themselves, the party of free speech because they did not believe in cancel culture. Right. Well, that's hypocritical, and I'll get to why I think that's hypocritical. But I think it's also, we're conflating a few different things here. I mean, not too long before that, you had President Trump famously violently shut down a protest in Washington at a place called Lafayette Park. Yep. In order for him to walk through the park unmolested with a Bible, upside down, which he then held in front of a church that he rarely attends. And because he thought his exercise of free speech was more important than others' exercise of free speech. So let me just talk about a couple of things here. Yeah. A couple of years ago, the president passed an executive order because he was disturbed by exactly what you're talking about the state of free speech on college campuses. Yes. And he basically ordered college campuses to do what most were already doing, which is to obey the law, or they would not get federal funding. I mean, it was one of Trump's typical executive orders, which really did not do anything, but it seems like it's doing something. But the impetus for that was a set of speeches that Milo Yiannopoulos, had given at University of California, Berkeley. And one got a lot of coverage because he was invited by, I think, the young Republicans, in Berkeley. And again, it's given the biggest venue they had on campus to speak. Campus hired the university paid millions of dollars in security to try to make sure that it was a safe event. But it was crashed by outsiders, by people calling themselves Antifa and others, and next thing you knew, there were violent disruptions, there were fires, there were explosions, and the speech was ultimately canceled for safety reasons. Apparently having very little to do with the actual students on the campus, but with these other groups, that came in and decided they were going to make an example of Emil Yiannopoulos. And so Emil Yiannopoulos, he complained, and he went on TV and he talked about how the left was shutting down free speech and how the left was anti-free speech and that this was horrible and horrible. The university did invite him back again, and gave him another venue. For whatever reason, not a whole lot of people showed up, but you had Milo Yiannopoulos, and then also Ann Coulter, who had some incidents in a few of her speeches. And now it's hard for anyone to take with a straight face an argument from Ann Coulter that she's been silenced. I mean, she's ubiquitous in certain places, but it became a political issue for them, and so you had these high profile people on the right who decided they were going to make an example of the intolerance of the left, and they basically intentionally egg people on. Now, were there are there excesses on the left? Of course there are. And many of these are being addressed. And part of what I write in the book is about the University of Chicago initiative of a few years back, where they issued a statement saying that we are not going to allow disruptions of speech on campus. We are going to make sure that people of all views are allowed to speak. And we as a college, we as a university, we respect the right of people to have free inquiry, and many universities across the country have adopted that. Some have not, but many have. And I think that what it sort of demonstrates to me is that on the left, there's a lot of people are actually trying to address this issue. On the right, on the other hand, I think two things are worth noting. One, I have yet to see some prominent right-wing group, defend the right of, say, people for choice to speak somewhere, or even with Black Lives Matter. I mean, you have the president on a crusade against them, and he's asking to bring in troops, to shut down their events. So I don't see it so much as a left-right issue in that way. But the other thing is that we tend to conflate free speech and the First Amendment. They're two different things in a way, even though they're very much related. Free speech is a much more general term, which applies to the right of people to express themselves in whatever venue they happen to be in. The First Amendment is specifically a prohibition on government from barring free speech. So when we talk about the aggressions of government, and then that's a different thing than talking about, say, Facebook deciding to regulate speech in this venue, or a private university deciding that they don't want certain speakers to come because they don't like their values. It's not censorship in any legal sense. If a private university decides to do that, you may decide that as a person who is all for free inquiry, you don't like that. And for the most part, I think that most universities do try to adhere to an idea of having people of various perspectives speak. But we have a government that's openly hostile to many expressions of speech, that has labeled the press famously as the enemy of the people. And that has consequences. So you have this weird dichotomy now, where you have, there's a Harris poll done not too long ago. And it showed that 91% of Americans believe in the right of free speech. 89% believe in the free press. But at the same time, 29% believe that President Trump should be entitled to shut down CNN or the New York Times because he doesn't agree with what they say. So there's a lot of confusion, and I think that the articulation from the left and from the right sort of adds to that confusion, because everybody has their own idea of what they're talking about when they're talking about free speech. And the idea on the right is fundamentally, we are speaking the truth, so we should be allowed to speak, and these anarchists on the left should just shut up. And of course, the view from the left is somewhat different than that.
Yeah, there's a lot to even unpack in that. Well, this is just an incredible conversation about something that I think is not only powerful, but incredibly meaningful, particularly at this point in history. And there's a lot to unpack in here. And certainly we're not going to get that done in one show. So
Right.
we're going to take a break here and going to end part one of this interview with with Ellis Cose. He is, of course, as I said, he is the author of The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America. Phenomenal book. The guy has written about the history of riots and protests. I mean, the guy's accolades are insane. You've got to go check him out. Ellis, as we finish up this part, before we go into part two, would you please tell our viewers and our listeners where they can find out more about you and all your resources and everything that you have done, so that people can reach out to you or get a hold of your book?
Oh, sure. The easiest place to find out about me is my website. It's my name, Ellis Cose, ELLISCOSE.com. It has descriptions of all of my books, many of my articles, and some of the other things, my radio work and some of the other things that I've done.
Wonderful. So go to elliscose.com, and there you'll find all of the things he just mentioned. And again, I hope you'll come back for part two of the show. Till next time. Stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about the cost and the price of free speech. I'm Dov Baron. Stay curious, my friend. Stay curious. I'm out.